Good evening. It's good to be with you this evening. Good to see everybody out. There's many of you back this evening, so it's good to see you back. We've got our song practice here, and after our evening service, and so if you stick around and like to learn a couple new songs that we sometimes incorporate into the worship service, I know Parker and Caleb and Evan he's been leading new songs at our college study on Thursday nights too, and so a lot of these guys work hard trying to challenge us with new songs that are also enjoyable. If I try to explain it this way: if I preach the same sermon over and over again, would you get tired of it? Probably. And so it's good to hear some old classics, but it's good to also challenge ourselves with new songs so that we might edify one another through them. So stick around afterwards, and hopefully we can share in that together. You know, there's a lot of talk in our nation today of government corruption. That's been on the headlines here a lot recently, and I would venture to say that it's been in the headlines for decades, centuries. Government corruption is not a new thing to be in the headlines, although it seems to be making pretty big waves right now. But there's a lot of concern about government greed and the mishandling of funds. There are suspicions of injustice that are making headlines as we question whether or not taxpayer funds are being funneled through organizations and used to buy the support of everyone from the executive branch to the judicial branch to the legislative branches of government. And the money trail suggests that some government leaders on both sides of the political aisle have been bought and have sold out for the sake of money. Now, I'm not here to talk politics. That was just what sparked the idea for this sermon. If you want to talk about that, we can do that another time. And really, I don't want to really do that with you another time either, because I don't like to talk politics with people too much. That's just a great way to get people upset. But some people start to question, because of some of these things, whether or not there is such a thing as fair and balanced journalism from our news sources anymore. Clearly, these types of actions are unethical. They are not unprecedented because leaders have long been tempted by the almighty dollar. Anyone who studies history should not be surprised at how our political leaders can be swayed by the promise of money or of power or of prestige. However, the idea of God's leaders being bought and selling out the truth brings about a level of strong disappointment, perhaps even stronger disappointment than it does with our political leaders. And there are warnings, and that's what I want to focus on. There are warnings about the danger of being bought, tendered all throughout the scriptures, no pun intended. So tonight, I'd like to consider some of those warnings because they're all over the Bible. And I want to make a few applications to our lives. Let's start with the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, the prophets often warned of the dangers of injustice because the leaders of God's people were bought. One of the first examples that we might consider would be from 1 Kings chapter 21 and verse 20. This is where the prophet Elijah, and I'm going to have most of these verses up here on your screen. You're welcome to turn, but you might be turning very quickly. And by the time you get there, I might have had it read. I encourage you to check me, make sure I'm not misrepresenting anything when you go home, but I'm going to put all these up on the screen. But the prophet Elijah once had a confrontation with King Ahab of Israel. And this was after King Ahab had conspired against Naboth. He had had Naboth killed, all so that he could take his vineyard and have his vineyard for himself. And in 1 Kings chapter 21 and verse 20, Ahab said to Elijah, Ahab is the king, Elijah is the prophet. He says, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" Ahab never greeted Elijah with very much friendliness. He calls him the troubler of Israel in 1 Kings 18. He calls him his enemy in 1 Kings 21. And Elijah just responded to him in kind. And he answered and said, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." You've sold yourself. You cared more about that vineyard than you cared about the people that you were supposed to be serving. And Elijah is upset and pronounces a death sentence upon King Ahab, which is fulfilled in the next chapter. It's not only in the Old Testament, such as with the kings, but we also find it in Micah. Micah warned of the nation of Israel's downfall and expressed God's disappointment in its leaders, saying this in Micah 3 and verse 11, her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe. Her priests, they weren't immune to it. They instruct for a price. Her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, is not the Lord in our midst? Calamity will not come upon us. They were saying things that were different than what Micah was saying. Why? Because people were giving them money, and they were willing to say whatever the highest bidder wanted them to say. Micah sees that in the nation, and he condemns the leaders and the priests and the prophets for being swayed by money. The greedy leaders of God's people were a big cause behind Israel's downfall, as their greed indicated their perversion of justice and of equity. If you look at Micah 3, verses 9 and 10, those two things are addressed. That's why it was a concern. It caused them to be unjust. It caused them to lack equity. And God's punishment, Micah would tell them, was pending, as you look at verse 12. Isaiah also mentions this injustice. Isaiah says this in Isaiah 1 and verse 23, your rulers are rebels and they're companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. They do not defend the orphan. Why? Because the orphan had no money to give them. So they were willing to defend the people who had money for them. They were not willing to defend those who were helpless, such as the orphan. It says, nor does the widow's plea, who no longer has a husband to provide for her, nor does the widow's plea come before them. They did not defend the cause of the orphan or the widow, and because of that, Isaiah condemns their behavior. In Isaiah 5 and verse 23, it says, people who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. And so the Old Testament has many warnings in the words of the prophets. Several warnings are found in the Old Testament, in the law and in other passages about financial bribes. Now, here's basically what a bribe is. Let me explain it to you with an illustration. When I was a young lad, I would guess I was 9 or 10 years old. I can't remember if I ever gave this illustration to you or not. If I did, forgive me. Sometimes I repeat illustrations, as my kids will gladly tell you. But I shot my brother. I had a BB gun, and he made me mad, and I thought I would threaten him. I had the BB gun right in his gut, and I thought I would threaten him. I thought the safety was on, and it wasn't, and I shot him. Trying to scare him. And he went down to the ground holding his belly. So I ran upstairs as quick as I could because I knew I was going to get the biggest spanking that you could ever imagine when Mom and Dad found out. And so I went upstairs and I gave them all the money in my piggy bank. And I said, please don't tell Mom and Dad what happened. And that's a bribe. Here's the unfortunate thing, because God will find you out. Mom bought a new shirt for my brother Dave that day and came home with a new shirt and said, Dave, I want you to try this on. Of all days, for Dave to have to take off his shirt and try it on. So Mom saw the big BB gun bruise, and I still got that whooping and lost my money. And that's a bribe. That's what a bribe is, all right? In Exodus chapter 23 and verse 8, it says this, you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. A bribe forces us to not be just. We need to be fair. We need to be just. If someone deserves to be punished, they need to be punished. If someone is innocent, deserves to be free, they deserve to be freed regardless of how much money you gave to a judge or someone who's making a decision who's supposed to be just. In Deuteronomy 16 and verse 19, the law says of the Old Testament, you shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Now, in the reading that Seth gave to us earlier, he read about Samuel's sons. Samuel's sons were contrasted with Samuel here in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Samuel's a good man by all accounts when you read the Old Testament. He's a good man who always seems to have done the right thing, but his children didn't turn out like him. And that's the whole reason, one of the main reasons the people wanted the king. They saw what the other nations were doing and said, well, they have a king. And they also saw, Samuel, your sons are not just like you are. And so that's why we want a king, because we really don't want to be ruled and judged by them. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. So he thought they were the heir apparent. In verse 2, it says the name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba, but his sons, however, did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, and they took bribes, and they perverted justice. The book of Proverbs says in Proverbs 29 and verse 4, the king gives stability to the land by justice, but a man who takes bribes overthrows it. It's the role of the king to be just, not to be swayed by money. That doesn't mean the king doesn't get paid. It just means that pay should not, you have to be extremely cautious and careful not to allow that pay to cause you to become unjust in your dealings as you rule. And God wanted his people to be constantly reminded of that, whether it be king, prophet, priest, or judge. In the Old Testament, how we remember God's leaders often has something to do with whether we view them as bought men. For example, we remember men like Balaam in the Old Testament. We remember men like King Saul, who was supposed to have destroyed all of the Amalekites, and yet he spared back some of the best of the sheep and the oxen. Why do you think he did that? Well, he wanted to go home and have a good roast, I guess. He kept some of it for himself. It was going to be added to his personal property. That probably had a lot to do with it. He chose not to do what God called him to do because he wanted to keep a little bit back for himself for his own benefit. But we remember men like Balaam and King Saul and Ahab as men who were bought men. They were men who compromised and flirted with evil for the sake of personal gain and personal prestige. But we remember men, on the other hand, like Elijah and Micaiah and Jeremiah, as men who would stand for the truth despite the consequences it might bring to their personal gain or even to their own lives. We're supposed to be learning from their examples. We're supposed to be learning from the bad examples, the type of people that we should avoid being like, and we're supposed to learn from the good examples, the type of men that we should strive to be more like, people of integrity. Well, the New Testament warns about it as well. Jesus offers warnings about the dangers of greed among religious leaders. In John chapter 2, I don't think it's any coincidence that Jesus begins his ministry throwing over the money changers' tables, and he ends his ministry doing the same thing at the temple. And so in John chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, it says the Passover of the Jews was near. This is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem to keep the Passover because he needed to keep the law. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords, and he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said this, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." He saw what the religious leaders were doing, turning God's temple into a place of business. You read this in Matthew chapter 21, though. He adds another phrase in this text. It says, Jesus entered the temple. This is the last time that he would go in there and flip over the tables. And it says that he drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables and the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer." That's the purpose of coming into the temple, so that it's a house of prayer. But you are making it a robber's den. A robber's den. Other versions say a den of thieves. Why? Because they weren't interested in prayer anymore. They were interested in how they could exploit the people for their own personal gain who were coming to the temple. They were greedy. In his strongest rebuke of the scribes and Pharisees, this would be the Jewish religious leaders, Jesus would say this in Matthew 23 and verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of robbery and self-indulgence. Robbery. Other versions say greed and self-indulgence. But this is not a pretty picture that Jesus paints of the first century leaders. Many times we are warned in Old Testament, New Testament scripture about bribery and about greed. Even the resurrection account was tainted by bribery and greed. If you look at Matthew chapter 28, do you remember this section here? It says, while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city. It's just starting to be found out that the tomb is empty. Jesus is not there. And so that's also going to help the message get spread that he is risen just as he said he would be. And so the people get really concerned about, well, how can we change the news? How can we spread disinformation about this? How can we change the storyline? Well, offer some money to somebody and somebody will lie. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 11, it says, while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers. It worked with Judas. Just pay off somebody that's going to give you something that you need to make something happen that you need to make happen. And it works with the soldiers too. It says they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and they said this, you are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. Here's the lie. All we need you to do is repeat the lie and you can keep your money. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble. We promise you protection. We're going to pardon you. Verse 15, they took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. That's why the whole idea about the body being stolen began to be spread. Should we be surprised that they were acting this way when these were the same men who gave Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray him? Some people will distort the truth and betray good people for so little. That's how evil operates. That's how it's been operating since the first century. Jude warned his readers about how some false teachers, in Jude verse 11, he says they run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit. For profit. As he meshes New Testament warning with an Old Testament example in Jude 11. Take a look at Numbers chapter 22. I love preaching Balaam, but Balaam is a long sermon because it's 3 chapters long. So it takes a while to tell the story. But I just want you to see one verse in Numbers chapter 22 and verse 7. This one won't be on your screen. Numbers chapter 22 and verse 7. It says in verse 7 that the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian, Balaam was from Israel. Balaam wasn't supposed to be working or consorting with the elders of Moab or of Midian. And yet they come to him. It says the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with a diviner's fee in their hand. And they came to Balaam and spoke to him the words of Balak. Why did Balaam even listen to them, even consider having multiple conversations with them? Because they had money. And he was hoping that maybe God would change what he was telling him so that he could take some of that money. Balaam never cursed Israel in word, but when you read Revelation chapter 2 and verse 14, again, this one won't be on your screen either, Balaam is referred to in Jude in the New Testament. He's also referred to in Revelation, and we're supposed to be learning something from him. In Revelation 2 and verse 14, it says, I have a few things against you because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. Balaam never cursed Israel in word, but apparently he taught Balak enough to bring problems into Israel. Peter tells us it's because Balaam, in 2 Peter 2 and verse 15, Balaam gets 3 mentions in the New Testament, but Peter tells us it's because Balaam, like so many false teachers, loved the wages of unrighteousness. That's what 2 Peter 2 and verse 15 says. Why did Balaam do what he did? It was about money. It was about prestige. He was interested in those things. And sometimes wrong pays better than right. And so he's willing to flirt with these false teachers and with a nation that he should not have been communicating with. Well, what do we need to learn from this? The Bible has instructions for church leaders that we need to listen to, and for Christians. And so we're going to start with church leaders as we think about the Holy Spirit issuing instructions about this qualification, because this is something that we have to look for in our leaders and in ourselves as we consider being the type of people that God calls us to be. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 7, before someone could be appointed as an elder, one of the qualifications that you read in verse 7 is the overseer must be above reproach. Well, how do we know if he's above reproach as God's steward? Well, he's not self-willed. And if you're willing to do things that are about satisfying you, and even monetarily, then you are self-willed. He says he can't be self-willed. That's not being above reproach, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, and not fond of sordid gain. Not willing to take a stand that is unjust and unfair for the sake of money. That's one of the qualifications that we look for in elders. It's not just mentioned by Paul to Titus, it's mentioned by Peter. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 2, it says, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily. You're just willing to do that. No one has to tell you to do your job. You want to do that job. You voluntarily exercise oversight according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. You're not doing it because of money. You're not going to do the right thing and serve for money. You don't do it for sordid gain. You do it with eagerness because it's the right thing to do, because we need shepherds in the Lord's church who shepherd the local church. Paul warned, though, the evangelist Timothy. So this is for evangelists too. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9, he tells Timothy, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. And so it's not our goal as preachers to become rich. And not only did Timothy need to learn that, but Timothy was going to have to preach that to those that he was preaching to. It says the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And we've already talked about a lot of those sorts of evil. Unjust dealings, inequitable dealings, not caring about those who cannot help themselves, but just caring about people who have money. The love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Imagine how dangerous church leaders become, who should be vessels of truth and justice, when they become more interested in money and prestige than they are in truth and justice. We have to watch that. We have to be careful. And it's not just church leaders. It's Christians too. Christians are warned about the love of money. We're to be on guard when it comes to the desire for money, because it can cause us to betray Jesus Christ by the way that we act. Jesus said to a crowd of disciples in Luke 12 and verse 15, he says, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. It's not just preachers and elders and government leaders who can be tempted by bribes and money. It's everyday Christians too. In fact, those qualifications for elders and evangelists, those really are just the qualifications that every Christian should meet. We just need to make sure that we haven't seen it in those who are going to be fulfilling the office of an elder or deacon. Every Christian needs to be on guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions, Jesus said. Life isn't about what you own and what you have. Hebrews 13 verse 5 says, make sure that your character, this is a character issue when you love money more than justice and right. Make sure your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. Trusting that God is going to get you through every day. Being content with what you have. Paul calls covetousness idolatry. Colossians chapter 3, we're going to get to this as we study through Colossians this year. But he says, consider the members of your earthly body as dead. These are things that we've died to when we've come to Jesus Christ. Immorality and sexual morality, I think, is specifically what's being dealt with here. Impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed. These are things we've killed off. I'm no longer going to make decisions on the basis of how much money it can make me. Greed is idolatry. That's something we've killed off as Christians. And so serious is this sin that Paul considers it grounds for church discipline. He lumps it in 1 Corinthians 5. We don't talk about greed in 1 Corinthians 5 very much. I've never seen anybody withdrawn from for greed. But it's right there in the same list as somebody who's a drunkard or somebody who's a fornicator. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 says, actually, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, sexually immoral, again, I think is implied there, or covetous. Right next to sexually immoral is a covetous person, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler. Don't even eat with such a person. The church was supposed to practice discipline, to disassociate with themselves from people who claim to be Christians, and they acted like that. And it's right there in a list of a lot of things that we wouldn't want to be. Perhaps really the truest test of discipleship has to do with whether or not we will sell out following Jesus and eternity for the sake of a better life or more money here and now. And so Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 16, as he ties these two ideas together, your eternity and how you handle your money, he says this in Matthew 16 and verse 24. Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Jesus Christ, sometimes, because he did the right thing, he said, I have nowhere to lay my head. There's sometimes he didn't have anywhere to sleep at night because he did the right thing. And doing the right thing sometimes caused him to be very disliked by other people. He says, if you're going to carry your cross, you have to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. Verse 25 says, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? If you want to be a true disciple of Jesus, then how closely you follow Jesus cannot be for sale to the highest bidder. If you want to be a true disciple of Jesus, then truth is not for sale in your life. And it's not compromised. We stand for truth just as Jesus Christ stood for it and went to the cross as a result of it. So the question for us is, can you be bought? Can you be bought? With these warnings in mind, it's important for us to ask this question because some people are bought with money. For some people, it's popularity and fame. It's not about the money. It's about how popular I can get, how famous I can get. For some people, it's power. They don't really want the money. They want the power. For some people, it's just cultural acceptance. And as long as a certain group is going to give them cultural acceptance, then they're willing to sell out the truth for the sake of being accepted with a certain group of people. And so it's important for us to guard against this. So I'm going to preach for just a minute and make a few points. I'm going to tell you, elderships can be bought. When an eldership asks a preacher to tone down the truth because it may offend some long-standing, high-giving members, that eldership is bought. They are influenced more by those who contribute to the collection than they are by truth. We need to be careful that we're not bought. When an eldership refuses to discipline certain unrepentant members, because that could lead to a mass exodus of friends and family, and that could have financial repercussions on the church, and that number over there, that could change. If we practice biblical discipline the way that it's called to be practiced, then the eldership is bought. Our job is not to operate the church like it's a business or a marketing agency, just looking at, what's going to be best for the numbers. People left Jesus over truth, and he let them leave. And he stood for the truth. When an eldership doesn't take hard stands because it might affect their relationships with certain preachers or with certain organizations or with certain Christians, then the eldership's showing you they're bought. Like a salesman, sometimes we care more about networking with our Church of Christ circle than we do standing for the cross. We can't be like that. What about preachers? Preachers can be bought. Preachers can be bought. When a preacher refuses to preach the whole counsel of God, that's what we're told to do in Acts chapter 20, verses 27 and 28. Paul says, I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God. When Paul was preaching in Ephesus, do you think he was tempted to be bought? There are a whole bunch of people that were very mad that he was affecting their bottom line because he was preaching against the temple of Diana, and he was preaching against pagan idolatry. If he would have just toned it down, he could have stayed in Ephesus, lived a good, comfortable life. Nobody would have ever said anything if he just would have been quiet. But he said to the elders in Ephesus, I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God. And it got me kicked out of this city. That's why he's having this final talk in the first place. I've got to go somewhere else, but I'm not going to be bought. The truth is not going to be bought until he tells the elders, be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. I was threatened by an eldership one time several years ago. I was told because I was standing for something and they didn't like what I was standing for, you better get on board, you're going to get run over. I'm not there anymore, obviously. I left. I'm not going to stay and be bought. I'm not going to back down off the truth because you want me to. I'm going to stand for the truth. But when a preacher becomes concerned that if he takes a position or preaches a truth, then it might affect his status with a circle of popular preachers, or it might affect his status if he connects himself with certain brotherhood magazines or well-known church influencers, or somehow, my gospel meeting schedule might shrink if I take a stand on this issue. And don't tell me preachers don't think about that. The preacher's already bought. I had an elder from another church call me one time because I was going to be preaching a meeting at some other church. And he called me and he said, I want you to know that if you preach at that church for that gospel meeting, then we will not have you back for a gospel meeting again. It wasn't anything I was going to be preaching or teaching. There was no false teaching that he could say about me. What he was doing was he was trying to financially boycott me for the future and use that to weaponize influencing me. Didn't have me scheduled for another meeting anyway, so I'm not worried about it. But it was a threat. It was a financial threat. I'm going to preach the truth no matter where I'm at, everywhere I'm at, and you're not going to buy me. Preachers need to not be bought. When a preacher refuses to renounce religious error because that could affect his family financially, then he's telling you, well, I can be bought. I remember a great story. This is a story that Will Sutton told me. But he told me this about his grandfather. His grandfather, Carol, really well known over in Albertville, Alabama for a long time. I used to read before I knew anything about, or I'd ever met Carol. I used to read his bulletins that he would send to our church when I was starting out preaching. But they noticed, if I'm telling this story right, they noticed that the church was really growing there in Albertville, and the parking lot was full, and he was having good success. He was very influential, and so a denominational member came over, I believe it was from the Methodist church, and said, how much are you getting paid? We'll pay you twice as much if you just come over here and just preach what you're preaching, because we'd like you to come over here. He wasn't going to be bought. And I think at the time, he wasn't really probably making that much. But I'm not going to be bought. I'm not going to preach your doctrine just because it's going to pay better for me. That's not how it works if you're standing for the truth. And I appreciate men like that. This is exactly, though, why so much false teaching persists. It's covetousness. Preachers can be covetous. Notice the connection in 2 Peter chapter 2. Notice 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. I can't remember if I had this on the screen or not. I'm turning, and it's right here. 2 Peter 2, verse 1. It says, false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you who will secretly introduce destructive heresies. A heresy just means that you're turning aside from the truth, even denying the master who bought them. I like that phrase. You've actually been bought by Jesus, and you deserve to live your life for Jesus. He bought you by something far more precious than gold or silver, with his own precious blood. But there will be people who will deny the teachings of Jesus and turn aside to heresies and bring swift destruction upon themselves. And it says many will follow their sensuality. They will have influence in the church and in the world. It says because of them, the way of the truth will be maligned. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle. Their destruction is not asleep. Did you see that phrase, verse 3? In their greed. Why do they do it? Why would they turn aside from the truth? Why would they turn aside from Jesus who bought them? Why would they allow large groups of people to go with them in their false teaching? Because they're greedy and it pays well. And for some false teachers, if it pays well enough, they'll teach whatever people want to hear. When a preacher won't speak out against false teaching that's promoted, whether it's by a college or a popular professor or a well-liked camp director or a well-known financial donor, the preacher is bought. And I'm afraid sometimes we may have some bought preachers out there. Well, Christians can be bought too. Christians can be bought too. So this isn't just elders, preachers. This is you. And this is me. This is us. For example, when we stay quiet in the high school or the college classroom while Jesus is being trounced and trampled upon by our professor or our peers because we're afraid of how it might affect our grades. And if it affects our grades, it's going to affect our graduation. And if it affects our graduation, it might affect our careers. What's that about? It's about money. You're bought. Thinking more about your career than thinking about standing for Christ courageously. When we go along and compromise in the workplace with immoral policies, and those policies are anti-Christian, so that you can keep your job, that you're bought. And when we stay quiet about Jesus for the sake of keeping clients, because we want to ensure job promotions, because we want to avoid missing out on that bonus check, we're bought. And when we won't speak up to our own families, because we're afraid that we might be the black sheep of the family, and possibly that will cause us to miss out on Christmas gifts, and that might even affect our inheritance money, then we're bought. And that's sometimes why people won't speak up to their family and take a stand for the truth in their own homes. Proverbs 23 and verse 23 says, buy truth. Do not sell it. Get wisdom and instruction and understanding. Buy truth. Matthew 27 verses 3 and 4, we learn about Judas. And sometimes a little bit of Judas can be in all of us. And we need to make sure that when we see those warning signs that we're selling out Jesus for our 30 pieces of silver, that we fight hard to push against that. And so, elders, don't sell out your church. Preachers, don't sell out your pulpit. Christians, don't sell your soul. Not all of us become millionaires when we're bought. Sometimes we'll do it for just a little bit of popularity and just a little job promotion, just our own 30 pieces of silver. I want to conclude with this thought. I want you to think about Jesus. And I want you to think about Jesus and the temptation. I was talking about this sermon with Jana, and she gave me this passage, and for some reason I wasn't thinking about it, but it's a great passage to close with. Satan is tempting Jesus in this text in Luke chapter 4. So there's two accounts of the temptation of Jesus. One is in Matthew 4, the other is in Luke 4. But in Luke 4 and verse 5, do you remember what the devil tried to do with Jesus? Try to buy him. Verse 5, the devil took him up on a high mountain. He showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, all this authority I will give you and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whomever I wish. And if you will just worship before me, all will be yours. Try to buy Jesus. How did that work with Jesus? Jesus answered and said to him in verse 8, "Get behind me, Satan. For it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God. In him only you shall serve." Satan was trying to get Jesus to sell out. The response of Jesus, "I will not be bought. And by the way, I am God. I already own it." What about you? Can you be bought, or will you stand for truth, no matter the cost, no matter the price? That's involved in serving Jesus. We've got to count the cost. Jesus stood for truth, even though it got him nailed to the cross. And as you carry your cross daily, keep standing for him, realizing the cost of your soul was paid for by his very blood. And your soul's not for sale. Speaking of the blood of Christ, have you been washed by his blood? If you're not a Christian yet, then you haven't taken advantage of the great purchase that has been made for you and your soul. Jesus Christ shed his blood to purchase the church, to redeem you from your sins. And if you have been bought by the blood of Christ, are you honoring the precious price that has been paid for your forgiveness by your loyalty to him? That's all he really asks of you. Just be loyal to me. Serve me. Honor my blood. Don't trample the Son of God underfoot again by denying me. Honor me by your loyalty. Are you doing that? If in some way we can help you here this evening, if you'd like to come forward and share that with us while we sing this song, why don't you come while we stand, while we sing.